On April 21st of this year, the film Planet of the Humans was released. It was produced by writer-director Jeff Gibbs, author Ozzie Zenner, and the ever-provocative Michael Moore. The film created instant controversy because it attacked some of environmental's most cherished leaders and programs. And then on May 23rd, British environmental photographer Toby Smith filed a copyright suit over a couple of seconds of his video footage, and the film was temporarily removed from YouTube. Now, defenders of the film cried censorship. They said that the copyright claim was a smokescreen, hiding the real reason for blocking the film. They said that renewable energy industrialists didn't want people to know that they were making tons of money off of supposedly green solutions that don't sufficiently slow climate change. And the accusations split the environmental movement. Many activists said that the film offered, many of the critics of the film said it offered an incomplete and unbalanced analysis and misinformation, and some signed on a public letter saying that this was a, quote, shockingly misleading and absurd documentary, and that it should be removed from circulation. Penn State scientist Michael Mann said the filmmakers have done a grave disservice to us and the planet. So we're caught in the middle of this environmental info war. Now, a disclaimer, I am a layperson trying to understand environmental science. So I'm going to leave things out, and I can't cover it all. But I will say that when I first watched the film, claims that we were being misled by an environmental industrial complex were compelling. But I also noticed use in the film of propaganda techniques and things that you see in conspiracy videos. Out of context comments, quick montages, fuzzy images, and damning rhetorical statements, things like, what are they hiding? One environmental activist told me that the film reminded her of something that filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl might produce to support the Nazi Party. I read a lot about the film, and I spoke to those who know more about that subject than I do. So I'm going to share today what I think it got wrong and got right. And I'm going to conclude by urging everybody to stay unified and become more radical in our environmentalism, because environmentalism is being held back by capitalism, and we have to stop protecting profits more than protecting our planets. And to do so, we need, I believe, more inclusive and radical dialogue, more inclusive and radical community, and more inclusive and radical governance and control of pollution. So let me start with the problems of the film, and there are a lot. The biggest problem is that the film doesn't have interviews with climate scientists or engineers. Most interviews are with arbitrary people found at environmental trade shows or climate rallies or Earth Day celebrations. According to one podcast I listened to called Side Note, which is produced by Michael Moffat and Gregory Brown. And by the way, email me, I'll give you this entire talk with all the references. But this podcast talked about the fact that interviewees included 25 festival attendees, 20 random people off the street, 13 job fair booth attendants and marketers, 8 hikers and tour guides, 5 loggers and construction workers, 3 psychologists, 2 college students, 2 authors plugging their books, 1 ecologist, and 1 zookeeper. According to Moffat and Brown, no scientists or environmental engineers were interviewed. And this could be related to a second problem with the film. A lot of the video is outdated. The information's outdated. Environmental engineering changes fast, so using film and statistics from a decade ago is a problem. The film shows General Motors' 2010 introduction of the Chevy Volt, an electric vehicle, and they say it's charged off an electrical grid that's 95% coal powered. But the film doesn't mention that today's grid relies less on fossil fuels, and most importantly, that electric cars today are much more efficient than they were 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Similarly, the film criticizes solar panels for being only 8% efficient and degrading quickly. But John Rogers of the Union of Concerned Scientists installed commercially available solar panels on his own house 4 years ago that were 22% efficient. And according to the National Energy Renewable Laboratory, today's panels are designed to produce at 90% capacity even after 20 years, which is the length of most current warranties. Gibbs also uses video from a solar field that seems abandoned, as if to prove that solar energy has failed. But in actuality, the field was being renovated to increase efficiency. And just for good measure, Gibbs makes fun of an environmental festival from 15 years ago for failing to live up to its powered 100% by renewables claim when a rainstorm came, blocked the sun, and so the grid was used to power the festival. But again, dated videos don't reflect current realities. Critics also pointed to misinformation, particularly the constant refrain in the film that environmental groups are totally controlled by capitalists. Gibbs, who narrates the film, claims the takeover of the environmental community by capitalists is complete. I discussed this with Joanna Newman, Senior Director for Environment America's campaign for 100% renewable energy, and she claimed that this is simply a lie. She admits that there exists inappropriate corporate influence, but she insists that environmental groups spend a lot more time fighting corporations than figuring out how to get paid off by them. She insists that her environmental work is, quote, fueled by small donor support of millions who give modest donations so they can better pool their power and values and advocate on their behalf, so we can advocate on their behalf. Another deceptive element of Planet of the Humans is how it portrays the dangers of biomass energy production. To begin with, Gibbs spends a disproportionate amount of time in the film condemning the burning of animal fat, corn, soy, wood chips. But biomass counts for only 2% of US energy production, so why focus on that? But even more problematic is that Gibbs lumps all biomass fuel energy production together. Burning old growth trees or CFC coated railroad tires or adding rubber chips to increase BTU production are environmentally condemnable practices, but not all biomass energy production is the same. I think the film's most frequent and questionable claim is that renewable energy sources, even wind and solar, are about as environmentally damaging as fossil fuels. Gibbs claims you use more fossil fuels to make clean energy than if you just burned fossil fuels. Energy America's Newman calls this claim, and I quote, complete hogwash. While all energy sources have infrastructure and supply chain emissions, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, coal and gas pollute much more than wind and solar. And the US Natural Renewable Energy Laboratory and Nature magazine both emphasize what you and I have been taught, and that is that green energy has a lower carbon footprint. John Rogers of the Union of Concerned Scientists points out that it was as if Gibbs was trying to avoid a decade of progress in green energy technology in US and especially Europe. A main example in the film is that it claims that Germany's renewable energy claims are overblown, that renewables are only a fraction of German energy generation. While my research indicates that there are a wide range of estimates of that, multiple sources confirm this, that there's tremendous growth in the percentage of renewables in German energy production. A couple of them said that in 1990, renewable energy was 3% of German production. By 2005, it was 10%. And by 2019, 46%. That's impressive. Another problem with the film is that it attacks individuals and groups who, by most standards, are doing the most to protect the planet. Kate Arnoff of the New Republic criticizes the film's constant ad hominem attacks. She explains that the film doesn't distinguish, quote, between renewable activists and renewable industry. Those are different. The film lumps them together as the green energy movement, and this monolithic straw man is then attacked relentlessly, smearing people like Bill McKibben and groups like the Nature Conservancy and the Sierra Club. And these groups may have flaws, like all of us, but some of them are the best environmental groups we have. So it's no wonder that right-wing groups have promoted the film, because it fits right into their lobbying for the coal and petroleum industries. Climate change deniers like the Heartland Institute and Breitbart promote the film. The Center for the American Experiment reveled in the film's accusations that McGibbon and Al Gore are getting rich off of environmentalism. I'm sure that McKibben and Gore have benefited from their fame as environmentalists, but the idea that they're somehow cynically self-serving seems ridiculous to me. In Rolling Stone magazine, McKibben says that the film criticizes him for the promotion of biomass, and he admits that he overestimated its potential, and I find his candor and humility refreshing. When the film's producers claimed that he reversed his position on biomass only a year ago, McGibbon points to a 2006 article he wrote with the not very subtle title, "Burning Trees for Electricity is a Bad Idea." He got no reply from the producers. Which brings me to another negative about the film. It seems more aimed to create a sensation than to nurture dialogue. This is precisely what many right-wing organizations want, to obscure the truth and lead us to throw up our hands and say, oh, well, I guess I can't trust anybody. As the New Republic Arnoff puts it, instead, parroting climate deniers insistent that renewables are as bad as fossil fuels, the film poisons the well for any kind of constructive debate. And as I said, I'll admit, after first viewing the film, I felt betrayed by my environmental heroes. It left me with a sense that everyone was in it to make money. And without researching the film more, one could easily slip into saying that truth is an illusion, that there are alternative facts and everything is fake news. And that can produce hopelessness. We can't afford that. Finally, I want to point out a more subtle but important problem with the film. About halfway through, it points out that over the past 200 years, since we began burning fossil fuels, human population has grown tenfold. While Gibbs points out that he never mentions population control, the film has a message that implies that there are simply too many people on the planet. Forbes magazine's Robert Bryce goes on to say that it's an anti-human film. Another reviewer described it as a Malthusian point of view, that we are the problem and the biosphere will kill off at least 1 billion of us to prove it. Now, I agree with some of that. In and of itself, I agree that our limited resources means we can't have unlimited population growth. But the problem is focusing on population control can lead both to blaming poor people and developing countries and to ignore the obscene energy use and waste of wealthy people, especially in the West, like you and me. It can lead us to focus on Africa and Asia and not on North America and Europe. I mean, of course, many people in poorer regions have many children and they burn dirty fuel like wood or dung in order to survive. For many of them, having children is their social security, and there are no other sources of fuel. Professor Leah Stokes puts it this way: the film concludes that population control, not clean energy, is the answer. This is a highly questionable solution which has more in common with anti-immigration hate groups than the progressive movement. The fact is that wealthy people in the developed world have the largest environmental footprints, and they also have the lowest birth rates. When this message is promoted, it's implying that poor people of color should have fewer children. Stokes adds, pushing population control is completely disrespectful of women's reproductive autonomy. Notably, almost all the experts of the film are white men, end quote. Brian Kahn, a radio host, goes further. He says the film has, quote, more than a whiff of eugenics and eco-fascism. And he asks rhetorically, who are we going to knock off or control for? Who decides? How does population control even solve the problem of corporate influence on nonprofits and politics? And relatedly, the film ignores how the complexities of energy policy affect working people. Who decides what industries survive? Are the unions consulted? Are non-unionized workers cared for? I mean, when the green energy related industries outsourced to other countries, what happens to the workers? And finally, and I think maybe most fundamentally as a problem, the film hardly mentions indigenous environmental activists who have been battling against abusive US energy policy for decades, centuries. Arnoff says that the movements that have shaped the climate conservation in the last decade, indigenous-led fights against Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines, climate strikes, and the Green New Deal go almost unmentioned. And this, to me, deprives the film of going deeper into the ecological approaches that are very different than those promoted by Western sources. I'll return to this in my conclusion. So, deep breath. Despite those weaknesses, there are strengths in this film, and some important ones. I'm going to start by saying that it's good to be reminded that everything that's labeled green energy ain't always green. There's a lot of greenwashing. Too often what's touted as environmental cures are partial cures with negative side effects. This doesn't mean we shouldn't develop renewable energy, but we need to be realistic. One example is the film talks about intermittency. In other words, intermittent energy supply. On windless, cloudy days, wind turbines and solar energy slow down. We may need some non-renewables to help during shortages like that. Now, some claim that fossil fuel plants have to actually run continuously because it takes time and energy to power them up, and that turning them off and on can create wear and tear. So intermittency with renewable energies is a problem that we have to deal with. Other environmental costs of renewables include the installation of wind towers, which reach over 500 feet. They're huge. And some say that it leads to the leveling of land that's similar to the devastation of mountaintop removal. Towers may not last more than 20 years, so new tower manufacturing will have environmental consequences. And many of you already know that wind turbines kill thousands of birds and bats every day. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't have them, but it means we have to address the problem. Same with solar panels, maybe the most attractive alternative to fossil fuels, but they require quartz and other rare earth metals. Batteries, which are used to power our electric cars, demand the mining of tons of lithium. And currently, the land and the people of Latin America are feeling the effects of a fevered lithium mining situation. And for all these reasons and more, green energy ain't all green. Technology cannot always rescue us. I mean, just look at what COVID, a tiny little virus, has done to us. And while I think the film goes too far in saying that corporate leaders are manipulating renewable energies for their own gain, the film does point out that capitalism's myopic focus on profit has negative environmental consequences. That's an understatement. I see some value in using incentives to foster growth, but capitalism should not shape environmental policy. Environmental policy should shape capitalism. Unfortunately, capitalists have too much power, and corporate donations don't always serve environmentalism. I mean, sure, Bloomberg donated 50 million to Sierra Club. Goldman Sachs invests in Brazil's sugarcane for biofuel. Sustainable investor David Blood has funneled billions of dollars into green energy technology. And then I want to be clear, I think such funding helps environmental groups. But corporations continue to beat the consumer drum. Buy more, buy more, buy more. They don't focus on the simplest and most important environmental slogan: reduce, reuse, and recycle. I mean, there's some money that's made in recycling, but reducing how much we buy, reusing items, those are rarely promoted by corporations. We have to reduce, we have to reuse. And for decades, corporations have blunted government and nonprofit environmental controls on industry. We know that. Near the beginning of Planet of the Humans, there's a 1958 film clip warning of the dangers of climate change. 6 decades later, especially given our current administration, it's clear that environmentally, we're going backwards in some ways. More federal lands are opened, mined, drilled, harvested. Pollution regulations are being rolled back. Steve Running, a University of Montana ecologist, says that while we're nervous about climate change, we are not nervous enough. Laura Schmidt, founding director of Good Grief Networks, says that our problems are as much cultural as they are economic and political. She says that the Western paradigms are based on exploitation of human labor and ecosystems. We're devouring landscapes, natural resources, and the planet's species, altering and tarnishing the renewable resources we depend on to support human life. These truths are nearly unbearable to take in, and most of us cope by burying ourselves in denial, avoidance, and false optimism. The film says that to save our biosphere, we have to face some grave realities. We have to lean into heavy feelings and process them and get beyond the shock and paralysis that they can induce. Schmidt continues, if we are to confront these big interlinked systems that are benefiting from our learned helplessness, we must come to the heart-wrenching realization that our ways of living on this planet are destructive and we are annihilating ourselves along with the life-supporting ecosystems and innumerable species. Schmidt adds that we should still support green initiatives, push for the Green New Deal, contact our legislatures, and demand more fundamental solutions. But we also need to change how we think and how we live. I mean, I like the fact that the film got me asking, what makes a happy life? I mean, we've long known that happiness doesn't come from just accumulating wealth. We appreciate the absurdity of saying that whoever dies with the most toys wins. But we haven't really changed how we've lived. And mainstream environmentalism hasn't emphasized that. I think we need to convince ourselves, as Joanna Newman put it, that less is the new more. I mean, we've learned in our current pandemic that driving less means more clear skies. We have to extend that thinking. Less meat production means more available food and less methane. Less golf courses and water parks mean more fresh water. Less material accumulation means more time for relationships, creativity, matters of consequence. This message is in the film, but it's overlooked by conservatives who gleefully promote the film. Eric Engheim explains that conservatives like how the film attacks environmentalists, but he explains that they don't understand that Gibbs and Moore and the producers of the film are different kinds of environmentalists. They have a more socialist perspective. They want greater public control of corporate use of natural resources. I mean, European nations have laws that mandate that products sold are repairable. So to minimize the disposable consumerism so prevalent in America, the film argues for lower consumption, something capitalism abhors and hides. Engheim says that Planet of the Humans is actually a far more radical film than anyone is willing to believe. Because on the more fundamental level, the film encourages us to shift our consciousness concerning human mortality, something I spoke about last spring and I'll speak about next month. As a species, we've gone to great length to explain away the transient nature of our physical existence. We've constructed narratives about eternal life through both religion and overblown faith in science and medicine, or we've just obliterated that concern by being all tied up in our material possessions. We cannot afford to ignore the realities of our fragile existence. Sheldon Solomon, who's in the film as a social psychologist from Skidmore, says that in the film that our inability to process our mortality is at the root of our problems. Yearning for immortality, we act as if we can't die. Craving a story assuming the immortality of the human race, we deny the potential of mass extinction. We want a belief that the earth is limitless, so we don't respect the earth's limits. The film quotes the existentialist Camus. There is only one liberty, to come to terms with death. Then the film tells us anything is possible. That kernel of insight buried in the film, which is too full of half-truths and misinformation about renewable energy, is not developed enough. Our challenge to live with less so we can live more fully is not a problem of science, engineering, or economics. It's a human problem. Laura Schmitz of Medium puts it this way. She says, our way of life is killing us. If we keep pushing forth measures to prop up our lifestyles, we too will die. Sit with that realization. Be with the feelings that arise from reading those words. It's a lot, I know, but it's also true. We must face our mortality and the mortality of everything. Schmidt continues, eventually, everything we know and love will die. Our lifestyles have been desperate attempts to ward off deaths. We are ephemeral beings who have gotten lost in our quest for immortality. These truths don't change in relation to our ability to stomach them. That's an important message in that film. As a conclusion, let me just say again what I said at the beginning. Environmentalism cannot afford to be split because of a debate over Planet of the Humans. We have to take from this film what is true and important and let go of what is trivial or false. We have to do so that we can create more inclusive dialogue, more inclusive community, more inclusive governance. For more inclusive dialogue, Gibbs and Moore and the producers of the film should openly discuss the film's shortcomings, and critics shouldn't say the film should be banned. Robert Bryce of Ford says that the effort to gag Planet of the Human reveals something more sinister, the refusal by leading climate activists and academics to have an honest discussion about the limits of renewable energy and why renewables alone cannot save us from climate change. I don't think it's sinister. I think it's just human nature. I think Bryce is onto something, though, when he says that there's something cultish about renewable energy communities' refusal to see its own limitations. Gibbs suggests that blind faith in renewable energies is almost like a religion you can't question. But I think that it really serves the film's lack of focus or lack of emphasis, doesn't point out the real self-destructive religion of unbounded consumerism. So I agree with Schmidt that Planet of the Humans is an invitation to look at the larger systemic issues being presented. And we need more of that dialogue so we can build a community and a politics that includes the voices of indigenous people pushed into the remote wildernesses of our country and our world, the voices of coal miners who have been abandoned by employers and the government as their industry downsizes, and the voices of people of color trapped in urban deserts as temperatures rise. We need more inclusive governance that listens to everyone, not just those with money. So I think the film does critique that corporate philanthropy has problems. We should absolutely hold nonprofits account when they don't live up to their missions. But the solution is not to blame a renewables industry for things that aren't true any longer. It's not to do everything we can to push forward renewable energies, but we have to do more. Ever since capitalism took control of politics in this country, and especially since Citizens United, the fact that multi-billionaires exist in a world where people go hungry is a big problem. That doesn't mean that philanthropic support for renewables should end. It just means that philanthropic donations shouldn't block more fundamental efforts to build sustainable environmental justice. Radical voices in the film are there, but they're just there for an instant, like at the very end or near the end. Vandana Shiva, an activist and scientist, questions the paradigm of Western civilization. She says, quote, "We shifted to measuring growth not in terms of how life is enriched, but in terms of how life is destroyed. We've overemphasized the conversion of natural resources into product that can be manufactured and sold. And that's why today, sadly, timber matters more than trees, bank accounts matter more than people, Black lives don't matter, it's wrapped together, and we emphasize renewables more than using less, consuming less, reusing. All that has to change. It's a shift of perspective. Planet of the Humans offers a little of that. It promotes a radical rethinking about our lives and our planet. And maybe we need to consider more closely approaches like ecofeminism that Shiva promotes, or maybe we have to do more heart-centered transformational work promoted by Joanna Macy. Those are topics for another talk. So today I'm just going to end by urging you to redouble your energy activism, your environmental work, and get as close as the truth as you can in the midst of these environmental info wars. Thanks for listening, everybody.